So welcome back, everybody, or again, welcome if this is your first time popping on. My name is Ashlee. For those of you who were here last week, you'll remember me introducing myself. For those of you who are new, I'm a counseling therapist and art therapist with Breelove Counselling, who has partnered with the Canadian Mental Health Association to be able to offer this series in this webinar. You'll see in the chat, CMHA just posted the link for the handout for this week. It was emailed to you, I believe, earlier today, but if you didn't get it, that's okay. You can just grab the link here in the chat. I'll ask that if anyone has any questions, or we have a couple of reflective questions today. So if you would like to participate, just to put your answers into the chat. Something that might be helpful too is, and I only learned this last week, is that when you see that to button, or right above that where you type your message, if you want everyone to see it, you'll want to go on and click and say all panelists and attendees. I just learned that last week, so that was something new for me to learn. All right. So yeah, I guess the way that we're going to start it off today is by chatting about asking some reflective questions, I guess, in terms of, is there anyone in this group that feels that they have been overwhelmed by stress? Yes or no, I guess, if anyone feels comfortable to answer. If you have been overwhelmed by stress, does anyone feel comfortable to give an example of that? I wonder if anyone relates to being especially overwhelmed by the pandemic happening right now, or maybe going through a major change or transition in your life. I mean, this pandemic was definitely a transition or a change. When you do tend to feel overwhelmed or yeah, completely overwhelmed, what term do you use for that? Do you call it overwhelmed, or do you have a different word that you use for it? Just overwhelmed? Okay, great. So last week, we talked a lot about how human beings respond when overwhelming things happen to them. So when stress is just too much. When things happen to people and they are overwhelmed, we tend to fall apart and we become fragmented in a sense, and feel like we're broken into pieces. When that happens, there's not really a good way to know what that person looks like when they're whole, and where to even begin to put those pieces back together. Can anyone relate to that feeling, or that to times in their life where they felt like everything was fragmented? Or that you were kind of broken into pieces and weren't sure how to put them all back together? Hmm. So there definitely is a way to put those pieces back together again, and to put some order into our lives, especially in these unprecedented times like dealing with a pandemic. So how do we start to put those pieces back together? If we think of this kind of like a puzzle, when we do puzzles, we tend to start with the corners, right, or the edges when we start to think about putting it back together. So for our puzzle is, for the remainder of this webinar series, will be the idea of focusing on self. So self stands for sense of safety, emotion regulation, significant loss or loss of control, and difficulties seeing future. So when we do face overwhelming emotions and we do struggle, these are the things that we struggle with, right? That lack of sense of safety. We struggle with emotion regulation. We feel that there's a significant loss or loss of control, and we have a hard time seeing how the future is going to play out. So our webinar series will be working through each puzzle piece in order to achieve not only vicarious resilience, but within the self, so safety, loss, emotions, and future. So these discussions will help so that when you are in the middle of a complicated, stressful situation, you know where to begin to deal with these problems. So there's a quote that by Eleanor Roosevelt that says, "You gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face. You are able to say to yourself, I have lived through this horror. I can take the next thing that comes along. You must do the thing you think that you cannot do." I like that one. So today, our topic in particular is going to go through that sense of safety. So safety is taking care of your body and yourself, physically, psychologically, socially, and morally. Physical safety means being safe in your body and safe in the world. Psychological safety means being safe with yourself. Social safety means being safe with other people. And moral safety means being safe with a guiding value system. So safety is also about setting appropriate boundaries. So saying yes only when you mean it, saying no and sticking to it, knowing the uh-oh or the warning signs of danger ahead, and knowing and experiencing the ouch of having your boundaries violated by others or even by yourself, or violating the boundaries of someone else as well. So exploring our sense of safety during this pandemic means also recognizing how our body tells us that we are feeling unsafe, or perhaps when we are in a dangerous situation. So some of us recognize that our body tells us we are unsafe or in danger when our heart rate increases, maybe our palms might get sweaty. But how does your mind respond to danger? Maybe you feel fear, have the desire to run away, you feel like fighting, you get that uh-oh warning feeling, or maybe it's like a gut feeling that you get. So these are all part of the stress response and describes the three possible responses to danger. So there's the fight, so we fight the source of our danger. There's freeze, so you remain still enough that the source of the danger won't notice you. And then there's flight, so you run away from something dangerous. So let's say, for example, we go into the woods and you're facing a bear. Most likely you'll have the stress response of fight, flight, or freeze. So what do you suppose happens when this stress alarm happens over and over again inside somebody's body? Some of us may actually use substances to cope, so drinking or using drugs to try and calm ourselves down. You might also feel angry all the time. We may get sick, or if already sick, your illnesses might get worse. Your eating might change, your eating habits. You might find yourself eating too much or too little, or eating food that might not be the best for you. You may become really controlling, or you may go numb and stop feeling anything at all. So chronic stress resets our biological and psychological barometer. As a result, even things that are not really very dangerous trigger that fight, flight, or freeze response. So you can participate in this particular topic by following the handout. How do you respond to stress? So check mark in the left far corner indicates your response to stress. With each checked item, you can ask yourself, does my response help the situation or make it worse? Then mark the ones you want to keep in the third column, and maybe start reflecting on those that you would like to change. So this is an activity that you can find in our handout that we have for today. So maybe something that you can do afterwards or later on in the week. If anyone is doing it now and is going through that, would anyone like to share some of the things that they would like to change about their response to stress, or maybe something that came up? Does anyone relate to that list that we talked about in terms of maybe drinking or using drugs, feeling angry, feeling sick or getting ill, eating too much, too little, feeling like a sense of needing control or going numb? Does anyone experience those? Mm, feeling sick, yeah. Yeah, that's another great one, Marie, is the not sleeping well. That's definitely one that it's definitely impacted by our stress levels, and when we're feeling more stressed, maybe we struggle to sleep for sure. Most of them, yeah. By looking through that list and by seeing those different responses, are there any that you may feel that you want to change, or maybe work on decreasing or minimizing a little bit? So, when we give ourselves permission to take a look at what is going on during the immediate stress response and then draw it out over time, we can actually begin to understand the effects of chronic or repetitive stress. If we are never able to stop, or sorry, never able to store up that surplus energy and are instead using up our energy stores all the time, we will fatigue more rapidly and also develop an increased risk for health concerns. So, under conditions of chronic stress, something goes wrong as the body attempts to cope with this massive overload of responses. So, the effectiveness of your response diminishes, and the body becomes desensitized to some of the effects of feeling unsafe and the stress that's being experienced. So maybe some of you can relate to the idea of stress or feeling overwhelmed being your norm and being kind of the usual way that you go about your life, and you're living in the world, is that constant feeling of overwhelm. So then what does safety mean? So let's reflect on this question, keeping in mind that safety is important, as without safety, there can be no real growth. So what does safety mean to you? Where and when do you feel safe? What is it about those safe places that make them feel safe? So these are some questions that we need to ask ourselves in order to really understand what safety means to us personally. So the important thing about being safe is defining the key ingredients of being safe. So those ingredients may have to do with physical security, something inside ourselves, like how empowered we feel in a situation, being around trustworthy people, or being in situations that support the things that we believe in. So again, we can kind of tap back into that sense of physical safety, psychological safety, social safety, and moral safety with those. So let's all think about the people in our lives that we feel safe with. What is it about those relationships that make them feel safe? Maybe you can just kind of think of that on your own, and you can share if you'd like to. On the same kind of topic, what about what about the certain types of situations that make us feel unsafe? What is it about those situations that make us feel unsafe? Marie, being respected, that's definitely one that is important in feeling safe in relationships. Absolutely. Trust, yeah, absolutely. Trust is a huge one in relationships that can cause us to feel safe or unsafe. Are there any types of situations that anyone can think of that make them feel safe or unsafe? Or any people in your life that make you feel unsafe, and maybe why? Marie, that's a great one. Sharing the same values, so that helps you feel safe, safe with people. Wendy, that's a good one. Yeah, being cornered or targeted at a workplace, that would absolutely make you feel unsafe. Hmm. Yeah, definitely, being heard is a huge one for feeling safe, whether it be in a situation or in a relationship. Absolutely. So, how does your body tell you that you are safe or unsafe? What kind of physical sensations come with feeling safe or unsafe? Rachel, that would be, I can imagine that would trigger a really intense feeling when you're in traffic and you have someone cut you off. It's probably very scary. That sense of safety or physical safety is being threatened in those moments, I guess. So safety is really a complicated subject, and being safe is not just about being physically safe. So safety is not particularly easy to define, I guess. Safety is a fundamental necessary attribute to mental wellness, just as much as containment in a therapeutic environment is important. So, containment is a word that we use to refer to the connection between the client and the counseling therapist. So, the atmosphere that the therapist creates that conveys a sense of safety, allowing the client to feel more comfortable to move through their own emotions. So, therefore, true safety is that kind of maternal, we kind of can call it maternal sense of support, a tolerance of distress and connection, along with the paternal sense of limits, discipline, and rules. So, in order to adequately talk about safety in the community context, we need to understand the four levels of safety simultaneously and how they interact dynamically. So, again, that physical sense of safety, psychological, social, and moral safety. So again, going it kind of more in depth into this, physical safety is the easiest aspect of containment to describe, largely because it relies on tangible and concrete factors. Physical safety is usually what people think of when describing the sense of being safe, since without it, the other forms of safety are really difficult to achieve. This is kind of we need this as the foundation. Physical safety alone does not constitute a safe environment for growth, cooperation, and vicarious resilience. Likewise, breaches in physical safety generally does not occur until the other forms of safety have already been violated. So, psychological safety refers to the ability to be safe with oneself, to rely on one's own ability to self-protect against against destructive impulses coming from within oneself or deriving from other people, and to keep oneself out of harm's way. The ability to self-protect is one of the most shattering losses that occurs as a result of traumatic experiences or chronic overactive stress responses. And it manifests in an inability to protect one's boundaries from burnout, compassion fatigue, or vicarious trauma. Social safety describes the sense of feeling safe with other people. Individuals who have experienced significant adversities, particularly interpersonal adversities, have serious difficulties in their ability and willingness to trust other people. Inevitably, this creates mixed messages in the realm of trusting yourself. If you have gone through childhood adversities, then you have come to expect bad treatment and are often suspicious of kindness, even towards yourself. How many of us have ever felt truly safe in a social setting, a setting in which we felt secure, cared for, trusted, free to express our deepest thoughts and feelings without censure, unafraid of being abandoned or misjudged, not worried about constant pressure of interpersonal competition, and yet stimulated to be thoughtful and solve problems and be creative and be spontaneous. Yet, this is the kind of setting that human beings need to maximize their emotional and intellectual functioning in an integrated way. Our social system is created to produce human beings who will fit into a highly industrialized, competitive, often pretty cutthroat capitalist environment that still prepares at least half of us for mortal combat. Our social system is not designed to maximize the human potential for growth and self-exploration, mutual cooperation, building the capacity for vicarious resilience or creative expression and exploration. It helps to be kinder to yourself and those around you when you recognize that the pressures are not because of you or that they aren't doing enough. Moral safety is a subject that is even more difficult to describe. So it is kind of a search, and it's a process. So it's an attempt to reduce the hypocrisy that is present, both explicitly and implicitly in our social systems. It engages in ongoing struggle with the issues of honesty and integrity. So something to ask yourself is, what do I really believe in? What is it that I'm actually doing? And what are we collectively trying to achieve? Will the means get us to the desired ends? And do the means justify the ends? So these are all questions that you can ask yourself when you're considering moral safety, and considering what that means to you. So let's look at some tools that can help increase your vicarious resilience and ability to recognize safe experiences and navigate through potentially unhelpful ones. So what's one of the first words that a child learns to say? Can anyone make a guess? No, absolutely. So yeah, what do you think, why do you think, I guess, no is such an important word, um, and that our kids learn that word first, right? So when a child says no, it's either because they may have heard no a lot because their parents are trying to keep them safe. They say it back to another person because they are beginning to define their personal and psychological space and their identity. No sets limits. No means self-protection. So now what's a word that you want your child to learn so that their world is not filled with no's? Right? It's that yes. So when we say yes, yes gives permission. Yes means getting your needs met. Yes means being in charge of yourself and knowing what you want. So now let's kind of change gears a little bit. And as you can see on the screen, we have a stoplight. So we have that red light, green light, yellow light. So no is a way of setting limits. It's the red light. Yes is a way of giving permission. It's the green light. But what's the yellow light? What is the equivalent word for danger may be present, proceed with caution? So a common expression that is a warning for something bad or dangerous ahead is what we like to call uh-ohs. So this means that a warning system of real or potential boundary violation, to be cautious, check it out before you proceed, think before you act. More time is needed to consider whether this is a yes or a no. And staying in the uh-oh too long can be a bad thing, meaning constantly being anxious and scared may cause the person to be tempted to use drugs or alcohol, cigarettes, or other behaviors to disconnect from this uh-oh feeling. When we say yes, when we don't mean it, we often experience what we call ouches. So ouches mean that we have not paid attention to the other three words and what they mean, and this leads directly to feeling ouch. So in our case, it could be burnout, compassion fatigue, or vicarious trauma. So the less we are aware of our uh-oh, the more ouches that we're going to experience. So now that we know our yeses, nos, uh-ohs, and ouches, it's important to intentionally say yes when we mean it, no when we mean it, and stop and think when you feel uh-oh, and when you feel ouch, and give yourself compassion and think about what you've learned from that experience. So what do we think of when we say the word boundary? What does that bring to mind for people? What is a boundary? Some may think of maybe doors, walls, fences, maybe a cell membrane, maybe even provincial boundaries, locks. curtains, clothes. So what purpose do our boundaries serve? They offer us protection, safety, definition, identity, responsibilities, rules, and norms. So what do you suppose that being unaware of our boundaries, so working in overwhelming conditions with a lack of resources, does to somebody's boundaries? Perhaps maybe your boundaries become too rigid, so you don't allow anyone to get close. You risk experiencing burnout, compassion fatigue, and vicarious trauma. If your boundaries are too loose, it may allow too many people to get close, which risks you taking on too much, saying yes to everything, and experiencing, again, burnout, compassion fatigue, or vicarious trauma. There's also the idea of development of all or nothing responses. So boundaries too rigid and impermeable, or having no boundaries at all. So it's either one or the other. You could also be unable to self-protect or set boundaries towards yourself, unable to get close to anyone, or feeling that kind of emotional bottleneck. So the decisions we make about boundaries can be called entrance requirements. So sometimes we allow people to come into our personal space, and then anybody can just come in. We have no entrance requirements. This also goes along with the perspective that we may take on too much in our healthcare role, risk complicating what our actual duties are and responsibilities in comparison to how we feel we are doing as a healthcare professional. Sometimes we keep everyone out. Our entrance requirements are so demanding that no one can get in, not even ourselves. We constantly are expecting more and better, looking for ways to justify what we need to break our own boundaries in order to achieve, at times, maybe unrealistic expectations of ourselves. Sometimes we might give mixed messages or change our minds about our entrance requirements, which complicates the expectations we set towards others and ourselves. And most of us have different entrance requirements for different situations and different people, giving us the opportunity to set boundaries based on circumstances, expectations, and our own realistic abilities to balance everything presented. So how would you like to change your own entrance requirements, or the way that you let people know what those requirements are? Again, this is a reflective question that we can ask ourselves. So when our stress response becomes overactive, we tend to be a victim of self-deprecating and insulting things that we say to ourselves. So when was the last time you insulted yourself? What does it feel like to live with this unhelpful gremlin? Does anyone feel like sharing? Do people relate to the idea of maybe a really self-critical mindset, and maybe criticizing yourself more often than you should? Mm, yeah. I think we've all at some point in our lives can relate to the idea of that self-critical voice. Yeah, exactly, Marie. We can be our own worst critic, right? I think that's very real for anyone, and at any point. Um, when we react emotionally to stressful experiences, we risk creating that unhelpful thought towards ourselves. So it feeds that gremlin. If we experience these things too often, it may lead to various forms of self-abuse. So again, physical, kind of excessive eating, drinking, using drugs or smoking. It may come across as psychological, so negative self-talk, internal name calling. Maybe it becomes off as social. So putting yourself last, putting yourself down, kind of excessive caretaking, or always kind of giving yourself away for the sake of other people. It could also be moral, right? Continuing to label yourself as bad, evil, or contaminated. So what did I guess maybe I'm sure all of you can imagine or think of a label that you've put on yourself, or maybe a common thing that you say to yourself that puts yourself down. And how does that make you feel to have that and to think of that all the time? When we talk about those high expectations that we have of ourselves, and then we beat ourselves up for not meeting those expectations, that's such a common thing. I think we all really tend to have high expectations. I'd be curious to know where those expectations came from, right? When we have high expectations, are those our own, or did it come from or did it develop from other people, and um, from their beliefs and the beliefs that maybe other people have put on us? Right. So having these labels can be detrimental to our mental health. It doesn't feel good to put ourselves down, or to talk negatively to ourselves, or again to treat our bodies poorly because we're coping, or to always be giving ourselves to other people but never having enough energy for ourselves. So an occasional name calling to oneself, is that okay? I guess it really just depends on what the meaning behind it is, right? I don't know if it's okay. I feel like if you're kind of berating yourself in that way, is that helping you? And if you believe that that's helping you, why do you believe that? Right? If we think about it, when we're praising or we're trying to get, sorry, a child to do something, do we berate them, or do we call them a name in order to get them to do what we'd like? No, we praise them, right? We congratulate them for doing something well, and kind of talk to them about what they may be doing wrong, right? So when we berate ourselves, it doesn't help us in any way. It actually just hurts, and it only increases that feeling of kind of self-loathing, I guess, or self-criticism. So that idea of perfectionism and having high expectations of yourself, so overachieving, right? Really, like, I think I would have put that on, that maybe there's a sense of a social aspect there, where you're constantly overachieving or trying to achieve perfection and having those high expectations in order to prove yourself or to prove something to somebody else. Does anyone else have any thoughts on these labels or how they make you feel? Okay. So, knowing the difference between self blame and self responsibility can make the difference between whether you will live with the unhelpful gremlin, or you'll be able to find peace with your authentic self. So, if you want to be respected by others, the great thing is that you just have to respect yourself. Only by that, only when are self respected, you show yourself self respect, can you compel other people to respect you. This is, oh my goodness, it's by a Russian novelist, and I don't know if I'm able to say his name. I'm not even going to try, but that's a quote by a Russian novelist. So do people identify with that need to that idea of, if we have respect for ourselves and if we set our boundaries and we really know what those are and we understand our entrance requirements, and maybe we start looking at our unhelpful gremlin, that how that can help us, and put us in a better position to be able to get that respect that we're looking for from other people. Right. Mhm. And if we agree with that statement, that we know that by setting boundaries and by looking at our unhelpful gremlin and examining our entrance requirements and being more clear about those things, if that makes such a difference, but do we still struggle with those things? And maybe why is it that we struggle to set those boundaries and to deal with our unhelpful gremlin? Okay. So today it was a little bit shorter than our last one, but I'm really happy to take any questions that we have. We still have about 20 minutes left. So any questions or comments or anything that you were surprised by or really resonated with, I would love to hear. I'm just going to stop sharing my slides. Just give me a sec here. Yeah, so does anyone have any questions or comments or yeah, wonderings about things or about what was presented today? So rigid boundaries. So again, rigid boundaries are when we struggle with emotional closeness. We tend to keep people pretty far away. We don't really let people into our inner worlds. We may struggle with trust. So it really is. It's kind of it's a more isolating boundary. So you tend to or we tend to keep people further away and just be a little less trusting of our bound or of them, of the people, of letting them in, of letting them come close to us, of being vulnerable with them. So this can also present in terms of having a rigid boundary, being unlikely to ask for help. You tend to have maybe only a few close people or close relationships in your life. You might be really protective of personal information. Sometimes you may, in romantic relationships, may seem maybe more detached or less connected. And again, you keep people at a distance out of that fear of rejection or avoiding the possibility of rejection. So setting realistic boundaries when you've been overachieving most of your life. Thank you, Marie. That's a good question. Um, so something to keep in mind in terms of setting healthy boundaries is again, knowing what your limits are at the knowing what you're willing to tolerate and what you're not willing to tolerate. And being clear on that. And again, as it also requires a certain amount of flexibility as well. So when we um, when we encounter new people and new situations, we kind of always are renegotiating our boundaries because they're new and we have to decide based on the situation that's presented or the person that's presenting themselves to us, whether or not we trust them, whether or not we feel that they're worthy of being in our circle. So you're constantly having to renegotiate that. So it does require a certain sense of flexibility, which is why I would imagine likely we struggle to set really clear boundaries with people because it does change. But I think part of that idea of setting those boundaries is really knowing what they are. And again, once you have a kind of a blueprint with important people in your life, that can help you navigate those new relationships as well. So again, knowing your limits and your values, those are really important. Understanding your emotions might also be something that that is helpful for you in setting boundaries. So really tuning in and listening to your body and listening to what your emotions are trying to tell you. When we feel, again, if we feel that sense of frustration or discomfort when we encounter a situation or a person, maybe it's because they've crossed our boundary in some way, or maybe we're uncomfortable by the way that they are crossing a boundary, or maybe we have crossed our own boundaries for the sake of that person, right? So tuning into your emotions can really be a good indication of what's happening on the boundary front. Another one, like we talked about at the end there, is having that self-respect and also respecting others, right? When we're able to have self-respect, then we believe that we're worthy or deserving of people respecting our boundaries. When we are able to feel that way towards ourselves, then it's easier to set those boundaries because we believe that we are worthy of them. Another thing would be working on maybe your assertive communication style. So being able to clearly and honestly and directly say to people what your boundaries are, to communicate that effectively. If we're not able to communicate those boundaries effectively, then of course they're going to be crossed because we're not able to communicate that with other people. So being assertive about our boundaries is going to be really important in how people see our boundaries or perceive them, and maybe even how they respect our boundaries. So we also have to take into account too that we can't just take kind of a snapshot view of boundaries in any relationship, right? We have to kind of look at the broader context of our relationships and maybe notice the patterns there. So some days I guess I'll use the example of with a partner, right? Some days with your partner, you may give more than you're taking. And because your partner is going through a hard time or they're struggling, and they may need you to give a little bit more than usual. Whereas other times, maybe you're taking more in the relationship than you're giving, right? So understanding there's kind of a give and take there in relationships, and that it's not always, there's more. You have to look at the broader picture there. Those are just some tips that I have off the top of my head. Does anyone else have any questions or comments about the presentation today, the webinar? So you can either use the chat or the Q&A option as well. So thanks for sharing that, Marie, in terms of not realizing, that maybe you haven't been respecting yourself as much as you could be. I'm glad that this was eye-opening for you. Yes. So the recording, this PowerPoint and this presentation is being recorded. It'll be posted on the YouTube page. Any other questions or maybe like I said, things that stood out to you, or comments on the webinar or the topics that we covered today? Thank you, Marie. Thank you, Rachel. So next week, our topic, let me just double check. Yeah, so next week we'll be covering the topic of that sense of emotion. So I hope everyone tunes in for that. Okay, so question about boundaries. Can they vary from one person to another? Absolutely. So when we, depending on our level of trust with that person, depending on how maybe long we've known them, or maybe the relationship that we have with them, our boundaries are absolutely going to vary. You may have maybe more loose boundaries with your family or with your partner than you would with a coworker or your boss, right? Or maybe same with, you might have looser boundaries with your friends and more rigid boundaries with your coworkers, right? So depending on who that person is and who they are to you in your life, it will depend on what kind of boundaries you have. I think something to keep in mind is that if you struggle with boundaries, if you feel that your boundaries are maybe looser or more porous than you would like, then maybe you don't notice that you have different boundaries with different people because you're just always letting anyone in, regardless of who they are or what they've shown you, etc. So something that's important to keep in mind is that boundaries should change with the people that come into our lives based on, what they mean to us, or what their, I guess, your trust level with them, or your how comfortable you are with them, or the importance of them in your life. So if you notice that there isn't really a difference in the boundaries that you have with different people, then maybe that might signal that you either have maybe porous boundaries or maybe too rigid of a boundary as well. So it could go one way or the other. But again, both those types of boundaries, so rigid or porous, can both be have consequences, I guess, in the sense that you're kind of constantly giving yourself away in some way for other people when you have either type of boundary like that. Any other questions or wonderings? Thanks, Sherry. So the question about how can I not give myself away? So again, I think the important thing to look at there is, well, what's the purpose that does that serve in your life in terms of giving yourself away? Who are you trying to please by constantly giving to others, and why is that so important to you? Where does that come from? Kind of be curious about that need to kind of serve other people more than you give yourself. Maybe that was a belief that was ingrained in you as a kid. Maybe that's how your mom is, so you've developed that same kind of pattern. So there's ways, I guess, that develops, or maybe we feel that it might be a case of, I worry, or you have fears about if you don't give yourself away, or if you don't constantly give to others, people won't like you or won't want to spend time with you. Or sometimes we have kind of a distorted belief about boundaries, in the sense that if we think of setting a boundary with somebody, we worry that they're not going to be accepting or respecting of our boundary. So we may pause or may not want to set that boundary with them because we worry that they might leave our lives, or not understand, or think differently of us, or be disappointed that we have that boundary, right? But that really is, at that point, if you're thinking those things, if you're worried about that, then that really just means that you're focused on the other person's feelings rather than your own. And so you're giving yourself away for the sake of that other person. So by setting those boundaries and kind of understanding your own limits and your own values, and having like that self-respect, then you're able to better manage those moments where you're tempted to give yourself away for the sake of other people. And maybe you'll pause more often and reflect on that, and decide, okay, maybe this isn't what I want to be doing, because this is disrespecting a boundary, and how can I navigate that situation in a different way. When you Okay. So by wanting to control how people talk to you, in terms of that you don't want them to give you advice, I think what's happening there, I don't know if that's a boundary thing, but I think it's an unfortunate situation where when you're confiding in people, oftentimes they're not necessarily actively listening for the sake of just listening and supporting. Oftentimes people listen, and when there's this problem, a lot of people tend to be solution focused and problem solvers. So they jump into that advice mode or giving things, giving options of what you could do and maybe, criticizing what you are doing. So instead of, when that happens, it is really tough because in that moment you feel unheard or unseen. And so that can trigger a lot of feelings. It can trigger anger, it can trigger feelings of anxiety or maybe frustration, or maybe you shut down or feel really sad. If it's the case of them being overly critical, I would, again, kind of ask yourself the question, what purpose or what role do these people serve in my life? And maybe how can I limit my exposure to these people? Is it something that you can work on? Is it because maybe is there a different perspective that you can take on it? Does it come from a place of care, or is it coming from a place of just pure criticism and just general, like, not being nice, right? And how do we tolerate that when people have opinions on our lives? And I think sometimes, especially when they're valued people or people that we really care about, it's hard because we do care about their opinion, but sometimes it's not always helpful. And sometimes it's actually more hurtful than it is helpful when they give advice or give their opinions on things. So again, just maybe understanding what your limits are on that, and being more assertive in the communication that you have in terms of asking for what you need. So in those moments where you're maybe talking to whoever it is, maybe you have to ask them for just to listen or just to support in that moment. That's been a helpful tip, I guess, personally for me, is that sometimes I have to specify, I'm just venting. I don't need advice. I don't need you to help me solve the problem. I just need to talk about it or get it out. So when I lay it out like that, then it prevents the person from kind of jumping into that problem solving mode, because they know ahead of time that I'm just needing to talk and kind of get it out. So again, being assertive and asking for what you need and setting those boundaries is going to be helpful in terms of getting what you need from people. That's a great question in terms of how do I know what my limits are, whether they're physical, emotional, etc. So again, I get that's going to vary from person to person, right? No one's necessarily going to have the same physical or emotional limits that you might have. And again, asking yourself really reflective questions about I guess maybe asking yourself, when you look back on situations, like those questions I asked earlier, what are situations that make you feel unsafe or make you feel uncomfortable? Why is it that they make you feel uncomfortable? And again, when you can reflect on those things, that then you can kind of tease out or pull out what your limits are and what it is about those situations that cause that sense of discomfort or feeling unsafe. Same with emotionally. What kinds of situations or what triggers do you notice? When you can really reflect on those things and start to examine yourself internally, that's when you can tease apart what those limits are. And then again, once you have that awareness, it's going to be easier for you to kind of move forward and set those boundaries appropriately. Great questions, guys. Anyone else have any questions or comments? We have a couple more minutes. I know that it's a weeknight and people are probably busy and tired after a long day. So if you don't have any more questions, you can head out. But again, thank you all for being here. It was really great to get to present with you. And again, I hope to see most of you back next week. But yeah, I'm here to answer any questions for the next couple minutes if anyone has any. So setting moral boundaries. That's a great one. So again, I think I guess maybe understanding again what your values are is going to be really important in terms of setting those moral boundaries. That's really the guiding principle behind our moral boundaries, is our values and our kind of that guiding system that we use in our lives. One sec, I'm going to pull up the slides again. Yeah, so again, it's like it's the value system that we have. What do we really believe in? What is it that we're actually doing in life, and what are we trying to achieve? What's the desired end of what we're trying to get to? And do the ends justify the means? So I think it's about it's the reflective question. A lot of our boundaries and setting those boundaries is, again, having that self-reflection and understanding ourselves on a deeper level, and being willing to be curious about ourselves and ask ourselves those questions about what it is that we want, what do I believe in, what do I feel is important in the world, what beliefs do I have about the world, and what kind of expectations do I have of myself and others in the world, right? So just kind of questions like that. And no problem, I'm happy to answer the questions. I appreciate them. So again, the recordings are going to be on the Canadian Mental Health Association's YouTube page. So if you just Google CMHA NB YouTube, it should pop up. So they should be there. The link has been posted in the chat if you're interested in grabbing it. Any last minute questions or comments? Again, I really appreciate you all being here and for participating. It's been great getting to speak with you this evening. Okay. Thanks, Rachel. All right. So again, if there's no other questions, we'll probably we'll end the meeting here. But again, thank you so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate it. And again, hopefully we'll see you all next week for our week 3 for the series. All right. So take care, everybody. I hope you all have a good rest of your week. And again, hopefully see you next time.